Okay, so do the survey if you haven't, and I'll keep grading stuff. I'm super sorry that I'm slow about the grading, but I'll try to get caught up by the end of the week. I don't think that's an unreasonable expectation for me, although clearly thinking I could get it done with the conference and the start of soccer season before class today, not even close. Yeah, I haven't even been home most of the time. And while I was away, I definitely didn't get any of this done. So I'm sorry. I said I was going to stop taking roll, and then I'm still writing stuff down. I'll stop. Okay, so do the quiz. I'll grade the stuff. Do the survey. Now, on the quiz, some of you ask, is it okay if we redid the quiz, can we get our second grade or our third grade? No, you can't, because you already saw the questions. So yeah, the questions didn't change from quiz, whichever version of, or whichever time you took the quiz. So yeah, I can't count it after you've already seen the question. So, and the directives are pretty clear about that. It says you got to take them in you got to take the quiz in one sitting. So, and if one of the things that is a little tricky, I think, because we're just so online, if you have modifications for the quiz, I don't know that it's easy for you to get any of those modifications other than extra time, which I really tried to build into. I can't imagine any of you needed as much time as I gave you to take that quiz. But if you had issues with time or something like that, let me know. But yeah, first try on the quiz. I've also had a couple people ask if they can argue that I should have counted their answer right because it was better than the other. And I'll just suggest to you that even if the answer wasn't perfect, and I'll answer you individually, I'm not saying that I won't, but even if the answer wasn't perfect, what you're looking for is the answer that's the best of the ones that are given. So I'm pretty sure I'll be able to suggest to whoever it is that told me that their answer was better than mine that I'm probably right, but we'll see. You may or may not agree with me. We'll see. Maybe it'll work out for both of us. All right. Sorry, I said I was going to stop looking at the roll and then I didn't. Okay, I'm putting it aside, putting it upside down. Okay, so I'm trying to think if there's anything else we need to talk about. I put the lecture notes in the course documents section, and I will add the weekly questions in the assignment section. I think maybe I put weekly question number 1 in there, but I may not have. So I will add those things. I'll add the weekly questions today in case you're in a super hurry to get them done. And the notes are already there. And then I'll add the quiz review once I've made the quiz, and I'll look at the survey results to kind of guide how many questions I make, but I have a pretty good idea already what I want to ask about. So I probably should be able to get that to you by Thursday in the course documents section. All right, do you guys have any questions you want to ask before we start looking at the stuff for today, which is the progressive era? Progressive era. I'm going to talk about the news, the weather. Do you have any questions about class? That's what I wanted to know. Also, I'm just going to mention, and then we'll go on. I have noticed that while everyone pretty much took the quiz, there are a bunch of people that didn't turn in weekly questions at all. Those aren't just suggestions, that's half your grade. So if you don't ever do those, you're not going to pass. So make sure you do this. I'm assuming those are people who just haven't come to class very much, or when you come, you just sort of log in and then go off and work on physics or whatever you guys do when you don't hit. For me, it could be the squirrel in the backyard, but I try not to look at the squirrel. All right, it's way more than one. All right, let's look at the weekly question. Oh, and I think I need need to let somebody in. Ah, whatever I just clicked on said end the meeting. Let's not do that. Okay. Here's what I need to do. Somebody's trying to get in and I couldn't find the right button. Okay. Weekly question, compare and contrast New Nationalism and New Freedom program. Be sure to mention details of each plan, including who devised the plans and what they include. So these are both platforms for candidates in the 1912 presidential election. And there's 3 candidates in this election, and you'll notice like she doesn't care about one of them. That's kind of true. And the one we don't care about, honestly, is the incumbent, the guy who was president at the time period. He just said, you know what, I'm president, I'm not running, you know what I'll do. So do you think he got reelected? No, he didn't. I just spoiled it, didn't I? I didn't even let you guess. The guy named Taft. Have you heard of Taft? William Howard Taft? He's the only president in US history, this is in case you're ever on Jeopardy, to be both a president and a Supreme Court justice. So there you go. So you are ready. You are ready for Jeopardy. One of the things you'll notice when you answer this question, New Nationalism is Roosevelt's plan, Teddy Roosevelt. New Freedom is Woodrow Wilson's plan. You go like, I don't even know who won because I know both those guys were president. Good job. Teddy Roosevelt's running as a third-party candidate during this election. And Wilson is the Democrat and Taft is the Republican. And when Roosevelt was president before, he was a Republican. So New Nationalism, New Freedom are different plans to continue the progressive era reforms. New Nationalism emphasized, you can guess, the power of the national government in implementing progressivism, and New Freedom emphasizes the power of the state government in emphasizing or in implementing progressivism. And New Nationalism would create a larger government bureaucracy to help run certain programs, and New Freedom would say, no, states can take care of that. And we'll talk about who does what for next week. All right. I forget what, oh yeah, Taft doesn't get reelected. That's why you said no. Okay. All right, let's look at the notes. Yeah, the notes. Notes. Here we go. All right. Seems like these notes are longer, huh? 9 pages. But we have 4 chapters. So the 2 middle units have 4 chapters, 18, 19, 20, 21 for this group. This will get us all the way through. 18 is progressives, 19 is, I think, World War I, and then we've got the 20s, and then we've got the Great Depression. So this will be cheery. Yeah. This one's not too bad, I think. Oh, maybe it is. We'll see. Okay. So progressive era is the era where we want to change stuff because we look back at the Gilded Age where we have really unregulated capitalism and we say to ourselves, maybe we should regulate that just a bit. Now, the regulations won't be as extreme as you'll see later on or currently, but there were really none before. So this should be a big change, and some people will think this is great, other people will think this is terrible during that era. Most of you will look at this and go like, that's not even a real reform. But for those of you who are really libertarian type people and you think the government should stay out of everything, this will probably remind you of just a few things you probably are okay with the government being involved in, like if you get killed at work, at the very least, they should pay something to your family, or maybe a minimum wage is not a bad idea. Although some people don't favor that. They think the market should be paid. So, all right, here's our business. So One of the things that affects the reforms during this era, and you'll notice almost all of these reforms will be related to the city, is that city populations have grown dramatically through the progressive era and also the era before the Gilded Age. So people are moving to cities. Why are they moving to cities? Is the entertainment better there? Your apartments are nicer. The air quality is better. You know it's not the air quality, okay? It is definitely the jobs, you are correct. So that's where the new jobs are. So factories are in the cities, sometimes next to the apartments. This is the era, progressive era, where we'll start zoning laws. Zoning laws could be irritating. All right, do any of you have to deal with zoning laws? Do any of you own a business or anything like that? Or you want to build stuff? I think zoning laws can be weird. I occasionally watch our city council meetings in Leander online. Those are online, can you imagine? And they argue about zoning cases quite a bit. It's what most of their council meetings are about because Leander's growing so quickly. And whether it should be residential, multifamily residential, whether it should be business or industrial. And you know, it matters if you live in that area. And you can also tell cities that have zoned very carefully and cities that haven't. I don't go to Houston very often, and usually when I do, I don't go down all the main roads. So you drive in kind of the side and you'll see like, here's a place where there's some cattle, and then there's a mini storage place, and then there's a house, and they're all right next to each other. So that part hadn't been zoned very well. During this era, they had factories right next to apartment buildings and no one could breathe and it was dangerous, that sort of thing. So they'll start to zone things. This is also the era where they start building parks in cities. So Frederick Law Olmsted and John Muir, those guys, conservationist kind of dudes, are pretty trendy during this era. Also, what's moderately interesting, to me at least, is that the progressives are both Democrats and Republicans. So the guys who want to make reforms, protect the environment, protect workers, they're Democrats and Republicans. So they both want to do the same things. How they want to do them might be slightly different. And in the end result, is that probably isn't. They probably want to do them in the same ways, probably through the federal government. So moderately interesting stuff, maybe. Okay, why do we know stuff's wrong? Because writers are writing about stuff being wrong during this time period. And cities are crowded, writers are writing about it. They're also taking pictures of it. And we're also getting to see this in newspapers, and by the end of this era, in newsreels when we go to watch movies. So a little bit of that, not so much, but it's fun. All right, so rapid urbanization leads to the need for reform. People are going to start writing about it, and then we're also going to figure out you can't just elect a bunch of people to run your city, especially when there are millions of people in your city or even tens of thousands. You probably need to hire some people who know what they're doing to take care of your city. So that's what you're going to start to see. Professional city employees, city bureaucracy and planning departments. And I think typically in this era, when we hear bureaucracy, we think, oh my gosh, I've got to talk to 5 people before I can rent the soccer fields at the park. That is my dealing with city bureaucracy, which is true, but without those departments, we probably wouldn't have soccer fields at the park. So I don't know, bureaucracy. We think of it probably as too many layers of people we have to talk to. In this era, there's none of that. So they create that so that your city has more services and is safer and more regulated, which in some instances is probably really good. In some instances is probably excessive. And all those opinions you have and should. Okay. All right, nickname for journalists during this time period who reveal some of the difficulties of the era is muckrakers. This comes from our friend Teddy Roosevelt, who refers to these journalists as guys that just stir up stuff. It's that his version of fake, excuse me, a little hiccup there, his version of fake news. He thought, things are not really this bad. They're just sensationalizing stuff so they get a news story and people will buy the newspaper. And then the more you look into it, it's like, no, they're telling the truth. So muckrakers was really supposed to be an insult at first for people who made stuff up and kind of exaggerated, stirred things up that didn't need to be, try to make things worse. But we found out that a lot of the nasty stuff was really nasty. You could read any of this type of book from this era for your book review if you so desired. Might be a little depressing, some of them a little tedious, and some of them just gross. So here's some of the books. How the Other Half Lives is written by Jacob Riis. That's completely available online. It's going to have some ethnic slurs in it that you may or may not recognize. You may learn some stuff in there you don't necessarily want to know, but what he does is go from different ethnic neighborhoods or through different ethnic neighborhoods in New York City and describes them, how people live, what the ethnic group is like, what they typically do for a living. He's also going to share his opinions about the different ethnic groups. You'll know by the end of the book which ones he likes and which ones he doesn't. His favorite ethnic groups, not even close, African Americans, because they're American and they work hard and they're clean. He's not going to like other ethnic groups, especially Central Europeans and Arabic groups, because he thinks that you can't trust them and they're dirty. So, and he'll say that and he'll call them names. But the main purpose of the book is for you to see what the living conditions are like. All that other stuff that I said would be secondary stuff. Shame of the Cities by Lincoln Steffens. Talks about getting rid of political machines, those corrupt groups that control city government and county government. Seems like he is particularly talking about Cleveland in his book. Ida Tarbell will write a history of Standard Oil. There's a book, I can't remember the name of the book, but it's mentioned in your book about the rate at which people die working at steel mills. Because there are just certain professions that are super dangerous and still are in some ways. Mining is still, and that they should have those TV shows about the deep sea fishing. That looks pretty terrible. Lucas Hine, almost any child labor picture you've ever seen is because of him. And he'll write about child labor as well. And the most famous book, I think, from this era is probably The Jungle. And you probably heard about that in your high school history class. That's the one where the dude, Upton Sinclair, works undercover in a meat packing plant in Chicago, which is called Packing Town in the book. And he describes the conditions that he saw there, which are really disgusting. And the thing your high school history teacher probably made you read, I know I made my students read it, was all the gross stuff that ends up in your sausage. Or about how Fred ends up in the lard. So, I mean, there's some rough stuff in there. The point of The Jungle really was to convince you that socialism would be better than capitalism. Mostly what it convinces you of is that meat packing plants are disgusting. So they end up passing the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act, in part with the urging of Teddy Roosevelt, who reads the book. Lots of people. Upton Sinclair will become a politician and eventually governor of California. He'll be the socialist governor of California because he wasn't just kidding about socialism. But if you read that book, you are probably not going to leave with any thoughts about socialism, just about meat packing plants being gross. Apparently they were. They're less gross now. They're probably still gross because, that's a rough job. All right, other concerns during this time period. Oh, I feel like I said this, but lots of people read these books and more, and it leads to reform because people are outraged by this stuff, and they want it changed. Other reforms that are big during this era, labor unions become more acceptable and people join them more. The two major unions of the era, one really big one and one international one, which doesn't catch on as much in the US, it catches on more in European countries. Industrial Workers of the World is the international one, and American Federation of Labor, which is still around as part of the AFL-CIO. So the AFL, American Federation of Labor, is a fairly conservative group of folks. It's the white dudes, skilled workers. They don't let minority men or any women in. They don't let unskilled workers in. They tend to resemble the people they're negotiating with, so they tend to be fairly successful in this era. They want better wages and working conditions. Those are referred to as bread and butter issues because they're kind of day-to-day, everyday expected things, like you get a decent wage, you don't get hurt at work, you don't have to work 80 hours a week to keep your job. And the reason they called them bread and butter issues is back in the old days, like when I was a little kid and really when my parents were kids, you had bread and butter with every meal. So that was just an expectation. You know, you had toast or biscuit, you know, or rolls or whatever. And of course, butter. So I know some of you are thinking that's a lot of carbs and fat. It probably was. But those are day-to-day things that everyone should expect. You don't even really think about them. So wages, working conditions. Their membership will triple in the early 1900s because they're successful and because there's a really large growth in factories during this time. All right, and lots of immigrants are white guys, and some of them are skilled laborers. So they do have some immigrant membership. So it's not just native-born white guys, but yeah. International Workers of the World, these are communists. They let everybody in because that's what communists do. This is why later on when we talk about the civil rights movement, communism sometimes is seen as superior to capitalism because of the philosophies behind them and the governments that tend to back them. You know, the thought is there's not as much racial prejudice or ethnic prejudice in a socialist or communist system. And sometimes that's true, clearly, sometimes it's not. We'll talk about all that kind of stuff later. Excuse me, but this is definitely a very philosophical era for communists and socialists because there really aren't that many countries doing communism, trying communism or socialism. And then once we have a few examples, you can have a different sort of argument, something more than philosophical. All right, so IWW, they want what socialists and communists want. They want businesses to be run for the benefit of the people, both the consumers and the workers, and they don't necessarily want one wealthy capitalist to own the whole business. It's either ownership that's shared by the workers or ownership that's really controlled by the people through the government. So they want the revolution to overthrow the means of production, to overthrow the control of the means of production, and to be more egalitarian toward workers and consumers. And socialist party is going to become more successful during this era. They're going to win some state and local elections. I think I already mentioned Upton Sinclair will eventually, we're talking 1930s, be socialist governor of California. I know some of you are going like, yeah, they're still socialist. Texans are so prejudiced against Californians. So, and I'm not native Texan, so from Missouri, the great state out. But the Socialist Party becomes more active, wins some local and state elections, and the national candidate, Eugene Debs, who doesn't win clearly, will run for president 5 times, but there'll be times when he gets over 1 million votes and he'll be relatively successful. And this will open the discussion about socialism in the United States. Now, it'll kind of close down after World War II. It'll come back during the Great Depression. It'll kind of go away after it closes down after World War I, comes back during the Great Depression, and really closes down after World War II. And then I think has come back in the modern era in a different sort of way. Or maybe the same, I don't know. You guys can decide that. All right, other issues that were important during this era. Oh, maybe I should stop. Let me stop for a second. Yeah, I'll stop and see if you guys have any questions. Do you have any questions thus far? Okay, do you think anyone's paying attention at this point? I think some of you are. I can even name names. Yeah. Okay. All right, you just don't got questions. I got it. Okay. All right. All right. Not trying to give you a hard time. No, but I realize listening to me talk for an hour may not be that exciting. I think I'm fascinating. My grandmother also would have agreed. Although if I talked to her about history for an hour and a half, she probably wouldn't have, to be fair. She didn't like history that much. Okay. All right, let's go back to the notes then. All right. Okay. Isn't it exciting in a history class when you get to talk about birth control? That's what I live for as a history teacher. It's especially cool if you're teaching middle school or high school and you get to talk about birth control in class. But here's the thing. People did not talk about birth control during this era publicly or with their doctors, or I suppose you could privately, because it was illegal. It was considered either pornographic or obscene. So you can have a public lecture about birth control, and doctors and nurses were prohibited from talking to their patients about birth control. Margaret Sanger, who's going to be the big proponent of birth control during this era, is a home, not a home health nurse the way we think of them now, but she would travel from different housing developments, not developments, apartment complexes in inner cities. She lived in New York City to help out immigrant women who couldn't afford health care, and they had public programs to do that. And she, in particular, spent a lot of time with the women who were having more kids than they wanted to have, and they would ask, what do we do to limit the size of our family? And the doctor would say, you know, that's illegal. I would suggest that you have your husband sleep on the roof or something like that. So they really didn't get helpful information. And what happened more often than you might expect is that women would try to self-abort. They would try to give themselves abortions when they had an unexpected or unwanted pregnancy. And there, you know, abortion, I guess, is as old as time. It's just super dangerous if it's not medically done. I'm not trying to be a proponent or opponent of, I'm just, you know, so people would use like liquids or fluids, poisons, typically bleach, acids, that kind of stuff, or some sort of sharp implement, and it would cause them harm or death. So she tried to care for people after those things happened, and that spurred her to become an activist about birth control and try to get people to talk about it more openly. And if you're wondering, is there actually birth control during this era? There's nothing, you know, this is still kind of a historical period, an old period for birth control. So the only thing that you see pretty consistently throughout history is knowing which parts of people's cycles are best to abstain, and then condoms. Apparently condoms are as old as recorded history. The only thing that's different is what you made them out of, which we won't have a discussion of now. But Ms. Sanger wanted to have the public discussion and got arrested many times, even had to leave the country, or felt like she had to leave the country to avoid prosecution and jail over this. Now, I will also say, because some of you, I know some of you, like, I'm pro-life, I know exactly who this woman is. So, like, I'm not trying to leave out the more salacious parts of Margaret Sanger. She's not your typical person for any time period at all. She lives an unusual life for a woman of that era. She's going to leave her husband, who is what she'll call a parlor socialist. He's really just you know, because his friends are socialist, he doesn't really mean it. And she really wants to change the world. So she leaves her husband and leaves the kids with him, which is super unusual during this era. Although if there were ever a custody battle, very few people got divorced in this era. If there were ever a custody battle, it would not be a battle. It would be whatever the man wanted to happen. That's sort of the way that would work legally in this era. So she leaves and goes overseas and is very open sexually. So, I mean, excuse me, I'm not choking about that. It's allergies. Or maybe it is about that. But she'll end up marrying a really wealthy man, oil guy, and she will continue to see other people on the side, and he's completely okay with that. So I would tell my high school students she's committed to practicing birth control as often as she possibly could. That's probably an exaggeration, but she definitely was not monogamous, which is, I think, unusual for women to be openly that way. Well, men probably too, but for anybody to be openly that way in this era. And in the 20s, she'll write about how she thinks certain ethnic groups should never be allowed to reproduce. And since she writes that down, we have that for all of eternity. And most of us, in some way, are probably a member of one of the groups that she didn't think should be reproducing. I know for sure that I am, and I know for sure my husband was, and so there you go. So she'll change her mind about that later, but you know, it's one of those things, once you write it down, or for your generation, once you put it on YouTube or TikTok or whatever, wherever, Instagram, once it's there, you know, it's, somebody still has access to it, so it's tricky. She wrote it down and published it. And when she changes her mind later, it doesn't matter. Now, she is the founder of something called the American Birth Control League, which will eventually turn into, yes, Planned Parenthood. So she's an incredibly controversial person in a lot of ways. People who are pro-life really don't like her and like to point out that the founder of Planned Parenthood is kind of an extreme racist sort of person, which she probably was for a period of her life. She doesn't have typical morality for the time period. There's no way around that, which some of you go like, why should there be a way around that? And yeah, I mean, she just sees the world in a very different way, which very, you know, it's unusual for the era. So she's pretty controversial. Emma Goldman, also controversial. She wants to talk about birth control in a public way as well, and those two will work together on that. But she's just your typical labor activist socialist. We'll deport her later on because we can. So this is a weird time period. We're getting a bunch of immigrants. So this is kind of the end of that period of the 30 million immigrants, like from 1880 till World War I. And we're going to have immigrants check in during this time period. This is kind of a first. So we're going to but require European immigrants to check in at New York City, Ellis Island. Asian immigrants checking in at Angel Island in San Francisco. Mexican immigrants might be checking in through El Paso or the San Gabriel Valley in California. However, the truth is we don't have a big system to look for immigrants who didn't check in. So even though we're starting to develop a system, and when you check in, especially Ellis Island and Angel Island, they do a medical screening, they give you an IQ test, and if you're not doing well on either of those things, we can either refuse you or quarantine you. The IQ test is going to be in English, so if English is not your native language, or if you really don't have a written language, you just have spoken language, you're not going to do well on the IQ test. And that's intentional, no doubt. And it's going to skew results so that people who are fluent in English are going to appear to be more intelligent because, you know, the test is in English. So checking in is ideal. it's still kind of easy-ish to get into the United States without checking in, and there's not a big system that keeps you from checking in. Now, this stuff tightens up after World War II in a big way, and we'll also see a lot of deportations in the 1930s that are, you'll probably look at and go like, did they really do that? No, yes, they did. But we're going to try to keep track of immigrants better, and lots of people check in where they're supposed to, so we know where they're, we know who came in and when. All right, if you're wondering, did we really patrol the Mexican border and make sure people checked in there? No, it's a big border. So unless you came through El Paso or you went through the San Gabriel Valley, you probably didn't check in. And also, it's a pretty fluid border. And it still kind of is, as long as the economy is pretty good. I know that it's patrolled, more carefully now. But I'm guessing there's some spot in Arizona where you can get through and nobody would notice, or West Texas. I don't know. I do know that, well, no, I'm not going to tell you stories about the one time that I went to Mexico and my friends announced that my husband was not a legal resident of the United States, which was not true. But the Border Patrol doesn't think stuff is funny. So that was an interesting experience. So I know that they do have Border Patrol. I know that. So, and you shouldn't joke around with them. All right, but the border is pretty fluid between the United States and Mexico. And when the economy was good, people would come and go basically for reasons of commerce. It becomes, it's a tradition during that era. All right, women maybe more likely to get a job and possibly a career during this time period. So, job, just you're working, and career is maybe you're getting extra training and your plan is to work that in advance and advance in that career and make money. The Charlotte Perkins Gilman book, Women in Economics, you could read that. I don't know how excited you'd be about it, but you never know. Really just talks about how if women really want independence, they have to have economic independence, and you get that through your job, and that is true. So, and that's still true for all of us in the modern era. If you get tired of your parents telling you what to do, you got to move out and pay your own bills. And the more money you make, the more choices you have in a lot of ways. Yeah, it's true. I mean, it seems unfair, or maybe it doesn't. Maybe it just makes sense. I don't know. All right, it's also why, I don't know, I hear people in my profession, especially high school teachers, complain a lot about their salaries, and I get it because they're not excessive. Just trust me on that. But also, I come from a family of people that don't go to college, and they talk about how, they work harder and their pensions aren't as good and that sort of thing. It's like, yeah, it's probably true as well. Yeah, I don't know. It's tricky. So, oh well. Back to business. We got birth control, we got immigration, we got women working. And, again, making money leads to independence. It just does. The thought during this era really still is that most women, they might work before they're married. Once they're married, they're going to go be wife and mom. And that's the main role for women. But if you lived in a city, you might have some more opportunities. And it wasn't true for all women, probably 95% of women. But you are going to start seeing women as doctors, women as lawyers, kind of briefly in this time period. There'll be a pushback on that in the 1920s. So, but this is an era where you're going to see women as reformers as well, too, because we've already talked about Margaret Sanger and her as a nurse, that sort of thing. Yeah. And also, I think we mentioned this later in these notes, but this is an era, too, where all of those professional jobs are going to start requiring people to go to college or have training. And that'll be a new thing as well. So if women can get some of that training and some of that education, that would be helpful. But there are a lot of writers during this time period, not necessarily progressive writers, but there's a lot of writers during this time period who will argue that the more education that a woman has and the more training she has for work, the more frustrated and angry she'll become, because that's what happens to people who work in the world of work. And she'll also be less fertile, so she won't be able to have kids, which needs to be her main job anyway, and the primary means of happiness for women, that's worth it. I'm not saying that guys aren't happy that they have children, but you know that they don't really, you know what I'm saying, they don't father children, but it doesn't bring that fulfillment that it does to women according to writers of this time period. I know some of the ladies are going like, why did she just say that? Because people wrote about it during that time period. I'm not saying that's the way I feel. Who knows? Goodness. All right. Oh, Henry Ford. It's time to talk about Henry Ford. Okay. Henry Ford, you've heard of him, right? He's the car guy. Now, every once in a while, I'll have a student that'll tell me that Henry Ford invented the moving assembly line, which is not true, but he is going to advance the moving assembly line and use it in ways that I think were unique and going to perfect it. Now, that does not mean that the jobs become more exciting. They probably become less exciting, but it does mean that he is able to produce a ridiculous number of vehicles at a lower cost, and they tend to be pretty reliable compared to other companies' vehicles. So he is going to create a system of mass production and mass consumption that'll be copied in lots of different ways. Okay. Do any of you have questions? I think that was probably just somebody coming in, but does anybody have a question they want to ask? We'll keep talking about Ford. I'm not done. Sorry. This is not where those of you who like Fords or Chevrolets start to argue. I have brothers who argue about that. I don't know if younger people do, but I don't know. All right. But during this era, the Ford plant was unique because it was well designed, it was safe, and they also paid a minimum wage when they didn't have to. So you were paid really well, you were safe, your job was boring as heck because you just did the same thing 8 million times a day, but it also meant you produced cars quickly. And Henry Ford's goal, part of his goal, was to help create this American standard of living that allowed you as the Ford plant employee to be able to afford the Ford. Yeah, somebody's asking about Native Americans. This is not gonna be, no. No, I'm just gonna go with no. They don't care about Native Americans. Here's one of the things when you have a moment to assess the progressive era, which isn't one of the questions. I really should have asked that, shouldn't I? Yeah, no, we're not changing the weekly question, though. I've already put it out there. One of the things that the progressive era is just, it's really bad about is they want to change all kinds of stuff. They want to reform all kinds of stuff. They ignore race and ethnicity almost completely. They do. I mean, because, you know, I just told you, if you read the Jacob Riis book, you're going to see all these ethnic slurs. And as we talk about the presidents, the progressive presidents, you'll notice they don't care about racial or ethnic stuff at all. And, you know, one of the big reformers, Margaret Sanger, is going to say certain race and racial and ethnic groups are so inferior, we shouldn't even allow them to have children. This is not a good era for people who are discussing race and ethnicity. The reformers, with a couple of huge exceptions, like the folks who started the NAACP, but this is an era where reform really isn't about race or ethnicity. It's about workplace safety and cleaning up government. I mean, you'll notice that with the amendments we're about to talk about. There's no amendment here that does anything about equality except, well, the 19th does let women vote, which, you know, is a thing. And a thing we shouldn't overlook. And It's the, oh yeah, it's the 100th anniversary of that. Yeah, yeah. So there you go. All right. So Ford, back to Ford a little bit, and thanks for asking the question. I appreciate it. Ford, lost my train of thought, didn't I? Oh, mass consumption and mass production. And you'll see that as a thing that just expands during this era and just explodes in the 1920s, where we just make all kinds of stuff and we convince ourselves and other people to buy stuff we don't really need. And maybe we still do that a little, although I think younger generations, except for your phone, probably don't buy as much stuff. It's also why they said younger people aren't buying houses, although that apparently has changed with the pandemic, because you don't want to live in an apartment with, you know, next to 100 other people in case they give you the COVID or something. So, but mass production, mass consumption is called Fordism, and that's fair. Yeah. And he does treat his employees really well, with a couple of exceptions. And here's a shock: they're going to have to do with race and ethnicity. I'm not saying that he doesn't hire people of different races or ethnicities. I am going to say that he expects employees to become Americanized. So if you're an immigrant, you know, you got to speak English at work. There are certain behavior codes. There are Americanization classes that they'll want you to attend, help improve your English and learn U.S. customs. And he's going to have a newsletter that he'll give to his employees. You see this more in the 20s. And what you'll notice is he's really racist. And the ethnicity that he dislikes are the Jews. So he's going to write a lot of anti-Semitic stuff, and pretty much anything bad going on in the world, he's going to blame on the Jews. And that's going to, you know, because he writes it. Again, when you write down your thoughts that are unacceptable, we all know them. So there's a book I read once, which you could read as well if you wanted for your book reviews, called Henry Ford and the Jews. And it's, you know, it's not good. And what you'll notice, he's going to get the highest civilian honor from the Nazi government for helping to design certain vehicles and other things that the Nazi regime uses. So that'll be, yeah, that's going to be a problem, isn't it? Yeah. So, but Ford as a business owner and a guy who runs a business, you know, for the era, treats his employees well. But also, again, you know, with the racial or ethnic comments, this is an era where, as a rule, that's not seen as unacceptable. All right. So I think we're done with Ford for a minute or two. Ford's important, so, you know, he'll come back. So if we haven't talked enough about Ford, he'll come back. Oh, and he's building the really large plants during this time period, and you'll see it more in the 20s, even to the extent that in the 30s, he'll build one in Brazil, kind of in the rainforest area. That doesn't go super well. Okay. All right. And it does mention in my notes, which I should mention to you, that this push for the American standard of living that draws a lot of people as immigrants to the United States, because then you can all become Carnegie. So, you know, sometimes it works out pretty well, but sometimes it doesn't, because there's such a huge range of wealth and power within the United States. And, you know, most people are poor or middle class. Most people aren't wealthy. And people aspired to be wealthy, and people aspired to have a lot more control over how they lived, how they worked, which is hard, because usually we work for someone else, usually. And even if you own your own business, it's still hard because there are rules, plus you have to make enough money to be successful. All that's tricky. All right, if you're wondering what are progressives thinking during this time period, a lot about how to fix workplace stuff and government stuff. Those are the things they want to fix: workplace stuff and government stuff. And workplace stuff usually turns into consumer stuff as well. So it's not all bad, but you will notice that the progressives, and you've already asked the question about it, progressives really leave out racial and ethnic stuff. Okay. So at work, there's an emphasis on how to make the workplace more efficient for people who run businesses. Now, that's not to make it more fun for the employee or to make them feel more valued or more part of the system. That really is just about workplace efficiency. So you could read this book. It's called, I think it's just called Scientific Management, but it's written by Frederick Winslow Taylor. And it really just talks about how to position things at work so less energy is expended and the workplace is more efficient. So how to be more productive at work, not necessarily happier, contented, fulfilled, but productive. They're not concerned about worker happiness at all. But worker safety does matter because, you know, if the worker gets hurt, he's not going to be very productive, which is true. And replacing an employee is hard. So, you know, even if there's a lot of people, you've already trained this guy, so you don't want him to get hurt. So it's safe and efficient, but unimaginative. So it's probably not going to be super fulfilling, but sometimes you have a job, and the reason you have the job is to pay the bills, to take care of your expenses and your family. And sometimes, you know, that's just what you have. You know, you may not change the world, but, you know, making Ford trucks does change the world because you get to help take care of your family, and that changes the world in that way. I used to think about that when I worked at Target, like, what is me helping this guy get toilet paper cheaper? How does that make his life better? You know, and I know you're thinking everybody needs toilet paper, but, you know, it paid bills. So you gotta pay bills. Help me get through college. Gotta do your thing, right? Okay. So workplace efficiency, not necessarily fulfillment, but everybody needs a job and money, so it's not all bad. Efficiency socialism was trendy during this era because it's, you know, still fairly theoretical. We haven't had a lot of government experience with it or governments that take on that system. And of course, in the modern era, we see democratic socialism quite a bit, which, you know, is a different version of socialism than, you know, Stalin or Chairman Mao or, you know, the repressive governments that we sometimes see in the modern era occasionally. AFL and IWW, so it's a period where labor unions are having more effect and sometimes are having successful strikes. Socialism and workers' rights also suggest the idea of industrial freedom and ownership of a job, as though every trained worker is entitled to a job, so therefore his boss really doesn't have the right to fire him. Now that's a very theoretical discussion and kind of an interesting one that no workplace ever adopts. So, and I say that without knowing every single statistic, but knowing that I'm probably right, because I can't think of any examples of workplaces where, you know, the employees got to decide what they did and if they got fired or not, because yeah, no one would get fired. All right, the Supreme Court during this time period sometimes protects workers, sometimes protects businesses, and they do it for a variety of different reasons. And there are strikes that sometimes are not broken up by the federal government during this era and are sometimes successful. You'll even have presidents, Teddy Roosevelt, who will agree to negotiate in instances of strikes. So it's a more effective time for worker protest. Now, I did want to briefly talk about these two court cases, and for whatever reason, I put them a little bit backwards chronologically. So Lochner versus New York comes first, and then Miller versus Oregon comes second. They're essentially the same case, but clearly in a different state. In both cases, the state has limited the number of hours per day or week that workers can work for their protection. So they want to make sure the workers are safe.
5:30 in the morning.
Uh-oh, somebody's saying hi to everybody. So they probably aren't going to know to mute. So we'll just listen to them say hi, or if it gets loud, I'll put it up and find them. All right, so Lochner versus New York is kind of loud, isn't it?
Here on the patio. Nonetheless.
Can you guys tell who it is?
There's like a literal. He didn't buy something.
I'm trying to look to see who's not muted. I can't tell. All right.
But I'm there like shaking.
Okay, we'll mute. Okay. All right, thank you for the help there. All right, and then if they come back, then we'll unmute them. We could tell who was talking to them. There's so many secrets that come out on the Zoom meetings, aren't there? I'm so glad we haven't seen naked people and stuff. Not, you know, I know people are naked sometimes, just not in history class. So. I know that's not the worst thing that could happen, by the way. All right, so Lochner versus New York, and thanks for the help on the muting there. Lochner versus New York. Sorry. In this case, the state of New York limited the number of hours bakers could work, guys who made bread and pastries and whatever, could work in a day because lots of dudes were getting hurt at work. And that's primarily a male occupation for whatever reason. And Oregon, Miller versus Oregon, which is like 4 years later, maybe 6 years later, is about women in laundries. Both of them are going to argue the same thing. The Miller and Lochner are business owners, and they're going to argue that the state doesn't have the right to limit the number of hours that people work in a day or a week because maybe they want to work that much, and you're taking away their right to do that without due process. So it's essentially a violation of the Fifth Amendment, due process protection, and then maybe the Sixth Amendment, and their general right to life, liberty, and property through their workplace. So in the Lochner case, Lochner ends up winning because the Supreme Court agrees that that is the case. And in the Miller case, the state of Oregon ends up winning, and they are allowed to keep the restrictions because the Supreme Court says that society is better served when women, who are the primary workers at laundries, are at home with their families rather than at work, because it's dangerous for society when people at work are not able to take care of their kids, and the assumption is those would be women. And since women are not going to be the primary earners, it's better for them to be home and have a limited number of hours. So you can kind of look at the cases and say, oh, well, maybe the Supreme Court wants to protect workers more, and that's why the Miller case says it's okay for Oregon to restrict the number of hours, but the Lochner case says it's not. It's really about who's primarily working in those professions. So the Supreme Court saying that the woman's place is at the home and society is better served by her being home taking care of her family may or may not be progressive in your mind. I'm going to guess it's probably not. And you know, part of the reason people are talking so much about Ruth Bader Ginsburg's passing is because she's one of the first people who won court cases that the 14th Amendment also protected women's rights to be in the workplace. So she would certainly argue that Miller was not a legitimate application of the law. I'm sure she did. I know that she did argue that. So, all right. I don't know if you want to discuss those cases anymore. I doubt that you do at this moment, but feel free to ask a question. I'll try to pay attention. And then amendments. You know, when we pass amendments, I'm always interested in that. And look, they passed a little cluster of them. Some of these are my all-time favorite amendments. I'll have you guess which ones they are. It's not the 16th. So the 16th Amendment is passed during this era, and it's really to create a pool of money to pay for any reforms. We didn't pay an income tax before this era, and this primarily affected wealthy people. I think maybe 10% of people paid an income tax in that era. Now it's probably about 50. I know some of you are going like, no, we all pay. What I mean is we all do pay because they take it out of our checks, but then about half of people get it back. I know, not all the taxes, just the income tax, but in this era, only 10% even were required to pay. And of course, they didn't take it out of your check then because they didn't have systems to do that. And in part, this was also supposed to be to pay off war debt from the Spanish-American War, but you know, that was pretty much paid off. And it's definitely paid off now, and we still have an income tax. 17th Amendment was direct election of senators. Before this time period, the state or the state legislature picked your senator. The senators are the ones that serve the two, you have 2 per state, and they serve the 6-year terms. So there's only 100 of these guys now. There were fewer states back then. So 2 per state and 6-year terms. So they're pretty powerful dudes. The thought was if you let people vote directly, they might pick a person they liked more. And they might also get more involved in politics because they got to vote and their vote counted more. Now, as far as percentages of people voting, you don't see a huge increase after the 17th Amendment, but you know, it was worth a try and really fits with the philosophy of the era, which is letting people vote for more stuff more often. If you look at the Wisconsin idea, which the book mentions about direct elections and referendum and recall, where you get to vote directly on laws, proposing them or getting rid of them. And initiative is where you propose them, and recall is getting rid of elected officials. If you live in Cedar Park, there was a push for a recall of one of your city council people who has some unusual ideas. It wasn't successful, but it was interesting. The 18th Amendment, one of my personal favorites, makes alcohol illegal. I think it's entertaining because I taught high school for a long time, and high schoolers seem to get upset by that. And then I would say like, hey, you're not supposed to be drinking anyway. And also because I don't really drink, so I don't care. However, I do recognize that this amendment was not completely successful. Now, before you tell me, no kidding, it wasn't successful, and why would you even think it would be? And it had to have been really unpopular. Let me remind you, on the unpopular front, to get an amendment passed, 2/3 of the states have to agree just to discuss it. And then 3/4 have to approve it. So anytime we have an amendment, it was a popular idea or it wouldn't have passed. We keep it for 13 years as well. So we keep trying. Sometimes it's referred to as the noble experiment. If you're wondering why they wanted to prohibit alcohol, it wasn't about teenagers in high school because, you know, not a large percentage of people even went to high school. Although by the end of this era, that changes because they are big on education, those progressives. But here's the problem. More people are moving to cities. So poverty is becoming more obvious. So the reason that they passed the 18th Amendment, there's a variety of reasons, but the major overall reason is because urban people are drinking too much and they're not taking care of their families. And these are primarily men, because men have the primary responsibility of earning the money. At least that's what society thought during this era. And we've got a bunch of immigrant dudes moving to cities and they drink too much because they're from places where their values aren't the same. It's a bunch of darn Catholics from Central Europe. And Catholics are so rowdy, they even have alcohol at church. So we got all the drunk Central European immigrants who come in, they get paid, they use all of their money for alcohol, they're puking in the streets, we can see them. They're not paying their rent, they're not taking care of their wives and kids. And who has to make up for that but taxpayers in the cities? So we don't want to pay for this. We want those guys to stop drinking. So the best way to get those urban immigrant dudes who drink too much to stop drinking, make alcohol illegal. Okay. If you make something illegal, it becomes more expensive. These guys are relatively poor. So would the 18th Amendment possibly keep poor urban guys from drinking? Is it possible? Maybe. Too expensive? Are they still going to find a way? Now, some of them will probably still find a way. That's at least the vote that I got from you guys. Because some of them will try to make it themselves. They call it bathtub gin, but sometimes that explodes the apartment complex, which is dangerous. So this is the one way in which Prohibition was probably pretty successful. It made alcohol much harder to get if you were poor, urban poor. And it was harder to make alcohol at the apartment because you might blow up the whole apartment building. So urban dudes really did see a decline in drinking. They did. Now, if you had money, you could still get alcohol. And it does breed kind of a disrespect for the law among upper middle class and wealthy young people. And of course, no one at all cares what people are doing in the country because you can't see people in the country. I'm not saying they're invisible. It's just you're not there. And, you know, from growing up in the Ozarks of rural Missouri, I can tell you that if country people don't want you to see what they're doing, they will hide it. They will, and you should not go seek it out. If you ever go hiking in my homeland and you see a cabin in the backwoods, just wave. Don't even wave, just pretend it's not there. You don't need to know what's going on there. So the 18th Amendment kind of works. It keeps poor guys in the city from drinking, but it also leads to organized crime, which isn't that great, and NASCAR, which might be great, I don't know, because people in the country are making and distributing and selling alcohol, and they need fast cars to get away from the police. So NASCAR, there you go. We keep that for 13 years. I think I mentioned that already, and it's overall referred to as the Noble Experiment, but I don't know very many historians who look at that and go, good job. It's probably a little short-sighted. And then, okay, it's a lot short-sighted. Yeah, okay. All right, 19th Amendment, nothing more important ever in the Constitution that lets women vote in elections. So there you go. All right. Since we have a little cluster of amendments, they're often referred to as the progressive amendments, and they're all passed in the same era. You know, you need to know what they are for the potential quiz. All right. So government by expert replaces government by politician during this era, leads to city managers versus mayors making day-to-day decisions in local government, also bureaucracy to help keep the government in check. Push for healthy mothers and children as a foundation for more educated and American society. So Americanization is going to be a thing. And the push for healthy mothers and children is especially in the case in urban areas when it seems as though men are not taking care of their families the way they should because they're drinking too much. Drunk guy, yeah. And then the immigrants. We really have a lovely view of people during this time period. And regulation and licensing of professions like law, medicine, engineering, social work, and teaching becomes a thing. So people are going to go to college or get extra training, and this will lead to more professional jobs, which creates a professional class, which helps create a middle class, and that typically is the group of people who want to do the reforms because they want to keep their standard of living and help persuade you to join them in their standard of living. All right, that seems like just the ideal place to stop, but don't leave just yet because I want to kind of double check on the roll and see if you have any questions. So you think of questions while I double check on the roll. I'm just going to say names of people that I didn't see, and if you want to tell me that you're here. Victoria Alvarez. and Kevin Bakos. And if you guys see the name, you can tell me too. Or not, we'll just tell them they got to pay more attention, right? Isaiah Castilla. And Eric Constantino. Ethan Contreras. There, I see you. You can tell me you're here, but I see you and I'm marking you down.
Yeah, I'm here.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And Miracle Curry. And Christian Limon. And Jalen Thomas.
I'm here.
I see ya. Okay, I just got you there. Sorry. I don't know how I miss people and why I do. All right. I feel like I'm good on attendance. Do you guys have any questions you want to ask? Oh, and I recorded the attendance part.